Okay, so here goes. So this is some undergraduate work that I did. This is the year 2000. And at that time, I was sort of discovering myself as an artist and taking courses, and I was interested in drawing and painting, or at least I thought that I was. And so I was taking figure classes and experimenting with materials quite a bit. So the piece in the upper left is actually a figure piece that's focused on abstraction. And essentially working with lithotouche as well. So I was always really interested in printmaking, but this piece right here and using the lithotouche was kind of my introduction to printmaking, which is still really interesting to me today, although I don't have the tools, although I still practice that, aesthetically in a sense. So in the top right is another piece I did in a drawing course. The lower left, I chose this piece because I started to experiment with color a little bit more. And also collage. So you can see I'm even using paper towels and just kind of mashing things into the paint to create texture. So not only creating texture with the actual materials, but creating texture with the materials themselves. So next slide. The piece in the top left, the green one, is, I consider it to be the only successful painting that I created as an undergrad. And so I wanted to include that one. And again, I was experimenting with materials, essentially collaging and mashing paper within paper and wash and acrylic and oil. I even was using glue stick and powdered pigment and kind of just throwing things. And I think that this painting ended up being pretty successful because I wasn't being timid, and it sort of opened a lot of doors for me as an artist, that particular piece. The two pieces on the right are intaglio pieces. I started taking printmaking courses actually, and these pieces kind of like start to show my sort of obsession with lines. Which you'll see in my later work. And so these two pieces on the right are really important to me because I feel like the line sort of came to me through intaglio and working with the line on a plate, but also printmaking in that process I sort of fell in love with. So anyway, that's the two pieces on the right. And these were done circa 2001. I included these two pieces on the lower left, which are actually pretty much the same thing, except just printed with different colors. So the other thing that I do in my work still is I create these iterations, or I create these different versions, or repeating the process over and over and over and over again, and essentially allowing like variables, whether it's me being tired or the different circumstance, a different time of the day, I don't know, something changes within the variables and it creates and produces different things. And I believe that came from my experience with printmaking as an undergrad, and this was 2001. So this is 2002, again, printmaking on the left-hand side. This is a Shinkalei piece, actually, again, using paper, but instead of mashing it into a piece with my hands, like on just canvas or paper, I'm actually using the press, or I'm using a machine, a mechanical machine, to create texture and mash things together. So this was a big moment for me too when I started doing Shinkalei to create texture with multiple materials. I included these multiple versions of this plate, which really, the image I'm not all that proud of, but again, it indicates this idea of repetition and just doing things over and over again until I get it right or until something, happens. And so again, that idea of iterative repetition. In the top right, intaglio line work, and I still love the line. Hatch making, cross hatching, basic drawing stuff. This was 2004, and I included the piece on the left because that was the eye-opener that I had when I completed this piece. Was process-based, and again, printmaking is very process heavy, but this piece on the left, instead of working from the front of this drawing, I worked from the back. And that really helped me to understand a lot of things that I would continue to do down the road. Here's a detail shot right here. But I started using wax, using different materials within my drawing process to create these experiences, but again, working from the back. This piece on the top right is really important to me because it was one of the first times I actually went to a site and sort of studied a landscape or studied a place and then kind of had a response to it, which kind of, led into my reasoning, because I have a double background in both art and architecture. And essentially, architects are trained to go to a site and do what's called site analysis. So you're always trying to gather all this information and you respond to it and you produce something. So this was the first experience that I kind of had that I believe kind of led into my interests and that sort of thing that eventually made me want to go to architecture school. So yeah, I couldn't find the photographs and I didn't have the room, but within this presentation, I did want to show some photographs with that kind of circumstance as well. So I graduated in 2000. When I graduated, I wasn't sure what to do with my BFA, so I ended up going to Korea and I taught English for about a year. And while I was there, I didn't have a studio, so I ended up working in my sketchbook a lot and doing, of course, a lot of line work, and that line work came from Intaglio. But this is a photo of me. Actually, I think it was my passport photo or my visa or something like that. And I brought it back after I came back from Korea. I was just really motivated to create some work, and so this piece on the left was one of the first things that I did. It's the only self-portrait I've ever done. And then I started doing real labor-intensive line work that you see in the top right. And these are two details. And then I also started taking printmaking classes again. So this is actually a serigraphy and lithography on the lower right-hand corner. And so that starts to open up my interest into printmaking. And this is actually serigraphy as well. So again, everything opened up into real labor-intensive line work, but I did end up getting a job outside of the arts. I was working at a homeless youth center here in Albuquerque, and for some reason, I guess maybe the job was stressful, so I would essentially come home after work and just work, and it was sort of like a meditative thing to kind of make me feel better after the day working with homeless kids, and hearing about all their problems and dealing with those issues. So this work also indicates again that repetition. So making these compositional decisions and then repeating it over and over again. Although this one on the far right, instead of starting in the middle, I ended up starting on the far end of each of the paper on this side and that side, and that created this ribbon. So that's what I'm talking about, these variables that kind of change in my work that essentially yield something different visually. While I was doing this work, I felt kind of like a machine. I felt like I was doing printmaking, and so it eventually led me to create this experiment where I just wanted to create horizontal lines just because I wanted them to appear mechanical. Let's see. This piece on the far left is that experiment again, except just doing it twice, so with pen and graphite. These two pieces were repeated as well. It's actually a lithograph. This one is obscured with white charcoal. This one down here is enhanced with orange string, so using an actual material with lithography and beeswax to add color. And that's something that I still always try and do in my process, is I'm looking for colors that sort of already exist in the environment and just fold them into my paintings, drawings. So instead of mixing color, I'm finding color and just kind of placing it. So this is just, more exploration of labor, lines, time, dialogue over here, conversations. Several nights ago, Orlando and I were talking about being home in quarantine quite often, and we were laughing about, the way that we were talking to ourselves, running around our apartments or trailers, just talking to ourselves. And so it actually made me think of this piece that I had done years ago, where I was trying to record the conversations that I'm having with myself, whatever's going on in my mind, trying to record it literally instead of with the visual. But process became more important to me, and then I started thinking about documenting that process. And so this piece is called 1,000 Lines, 1,000 Photographs. So all the one camera shot for each of the lines that I put down in a piece that basically resembles the same thing that you saw with this sort of thing, but documented properly. So then I started thinking about lines and space, and started creating these three-dimensional forms, or these design systems that would sort of do the work for me, the design work for me. And so this is actually a cube contraption that I came up with, where you put an object inside and it carves the object. At that time, I started to think about architecture. In order to go to architecture school, I had to take calculus, and I'm not really a very math induced person. So I ended up passing the class and doing okay, but I wanted to document that as well. So what I did was I took all my calculus notes and cut them up, because it appeared like some sort of visual language when I was working, doing that stuff. It sort of ended up being enjoyable, but I don't have any use for that except to create art from it. So this piece resembles a Roman polis, or organic kind of urban planning, and so that's what this is referencing right here. But these are actually aluminum strips cut up and actually pressed within a press, again, a printmaking press. So printmaking is involved, putting it on an aluminum plate, taking it all apart and putting it back together again to represent some sort of idea of place. And I'm not sure how we're doing on time. I'm going a little bit more slowly, so I'll try to speed up a little bit. But again, these sort of design diagrams that started to influence my work. This represents a window aperture. My painting started to integrate with sight very closely, actual sculptural objects. The sculptural objects would unfold from a 2D space to become a 3D form that would fold back into a 2D painting. So essentially my work was very, very much part of my architecture process and part of my 2D process. And that's really what's happening here on the right. But while I was doing all that, I still wanted to just make traditional drawings and paintings. But I was interested in materials. So what I did was, over time, I realized, because I'd done so many of these pen drawings, that the pens have a very sensitive life about them. So you might have to organize which pens you're using or in which order in order to yield a specific aesthetic result. So with this particular piece, I think I chose 2 pens, and of course it's that found color again. It's a micron pen. It's a very specific color, and essentially just allowing the pen through its natural course to disappear or erode. So again, me thinking about materials and applying it within a space, which I kind of consider an architectural site at this point, because it has dimensions, it has boundaries, it has margins. At this point, I'm using digital technology really heavily to do my actual planning. So thinking about the paintings and the drawings before they actually happen, sort of like, the architect designing a building before anything happens. It's all on paper and then executing. So the planning portion and the thinking about materials becomes really important. This particular drawing was actually a drawing that I had completed by hand. Then I scan it in digitally, and then I fabricate it using a machine that etches everything out. So using technology to do the work for me, sort of like an architect uses, modular bricks or materials that you would go buy at a shop. I'm trying to assist these other way. I'm trying to find other ways to expedite the process. The other thing I'm constantly thinking about at this point is structure, which is why all these triangles start to pop up. So, like a truss or a bridge has these structural members, to hold the load, and that inevitably kind of finds its way into my process too. This piece right here is really important to me because it represents tatami, which is, proportion and space and aesthetic, and also going back to, the wash moves that I was making, earlier. But so all the things, that I was doing at the beginning and still, currently, all the dots kind of start connecting for me. This piece is actually a site in Albuquerque. This is the sawmill site. Where, currently it's sort of this was 10 years ago, but now it's been really heavily gentrified and it's turned into sort of a hoity-toity neighborhood. But at the time, this was just an empty, abandoned area, and this was the building. This was a courtyard. This was, the space and how folks would organize themselves within that space. So, I was literally trying to think architecturally and visually in a 2D way as a painter. These types of moves that you see right here with the tape and the mylar, it's essentially, there's this idea in architecture called a section cut, you know what I mean? So you're constantly taking things apart, and so you can understand how they come together. And this is me kind of taking things apart, but then flattening them and putting them up against each other, with tape. It could also just be collage, but what I was thinking at the time was taking things apart and mashing them together again to understand the parts. Again, thinking about the site, thinking about found materials, like this is graphite on rubber on the lower right. These green pieces, instead of drawing on paper, I'm drawing on aluminum, light sensitive aluminum that changes over time. These more colorful pieces are based off of an experience at the National Seashore in Point Reyes, California. For me, this was an important move because I'm actually drawing on vellum, which is transparent, so I can draw on both sides of the vellum, and again, kind of exploiting that idea of the exploded axonometric or exploded view of things and how the parts come together. These pieces right here were kind of important to me around this period as well, because I was a little disheartened by the institution of art and the way that, the art market works and a lot of the things that we're all faced with as artists. And so essentially these represent kind of like death, graveyard, tombs. So, me kind of just thinking about the institution and not optimistically, I suppose. For a while, I actually didn't have a studio, so I started making public art proposals. And this one was actually a proposal in Albuquerque. This was a proposal for the San Jose Institute of Contemporary Art. But kind of using what I know within architecture to go into a space and essentially create something that's responsive to that space. And here's a diagram kind of showing, my thinking visually, the form, and then the structure, and then how things actually appear. But this was an interesting time because I really wasn't creating much except just digital work because I just didn't have the space or the means when I was living in San Francisco. I don't know if anyone's ever lived out there, but I lived in a very small space. And so I just didn't have the room to create the work that I wanted to be making. These pieces are design based. They're called RGB 1 and 2. And so essentially just more line work, going back to line work, but red, green, blue, red, green, blue, you know, just these simple moves to represent a conceptual idea of the RGB color space, which in theory adds up to white, right? But yeah, this is more public artwork. These were actually temporary installations that would have been installed in Grants, New Mexico. And there are 4 iterations. So again, you know, my tendency to kind of repeat things. So I basically repeated the process, 2D, 3D, the exploded view, and using the architectural language to kind of show how things are or what they look like. I'm going to start going a little faster because I know I'm going over time. This is more current work, public art proposals, working with 3D modeling to create these drawings that I'm rendering. This is one of a series of works that are based off of brutalist architecture, which is concrete based. So my interpretation, but also thinking about things like the Situationists International and Guy Debord and the way that those guys would go into Reeves. So, you know, sort of, you know, thinking about those folks that came before precedents. Going back to printmaking, this is serigraphy and lithography, grid system design. This piece is based off of San Francisco. So I'm trying to show a little bit more. I didn't have a lot of space with this presentation, but trying to show, you know, processed images of things that are useful to me when I'm going from something like this to something like that. I've also been doing these typeface pieces with Helvetica. And essentially, these pieces come from my constant fascination with music and LP covers and, you know, commercial graphic design, but, you know, taking it to a different realm, you know, primary colors. This is, these 3 pieces on the top are probably the most blatant use of this idea of the exploded axon that I've explored, because I have these multiple screens that are floating against each other but not touching each other, and objects sitting on those screens kind of relating to each other. And these pieces I'm leveraging cinematic color grading systems. So I'm going into movies and taking color and using those to determine my color palette for these pieces that are ongoing. These 2 pieces are essentially what I've been doing over the summer, and these 2 pieces are not complete, and there are some other pieces that are in process, but essentially what I'm doing is I'm cutting up old photographs and drawing on them diagrammatically to represent, yeah, figures. So, and I know I went over, apologies.
Oh no, it's no problem, bro. I mean, come on. I mean, you're talking about brutalist art, and you're talking about, like stuff that, I think makes sense to you as an artist, and that's what I always appreciate about you, man. So thank you.